Commander Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport plane at Naval Base Coronado, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and orders in hand. The California sun beat down mercilessly, but she had endured far worse conditions during her 20-year career in the Navy. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned their place through blood, sweat, and countless missions that would never see the light of day in any official record. The base buzzed with activity as usual. Young recruits jogged in formation, their drill instructors barking commands that echoed across the concrete. Sarah watched them with a mixture of nostalgia and pride. She had been one of them once, though her path had been far more challenging than most could imagine. Her new assignment was supposed to be a routine evaluation of training protocols at the SEAL preparation facility. What the junior officers didn't know was that Sarah Martinez wasn't just any commander. She was one of the first women to complete SEAL training, though her records were classified at the highest levels. Her promotion to general had come through just 2 weeks ago, but she had requested that her new rank remain confidential until she completed this particular mission. As she walked across the base, Sarah noticed the familiar sounds and smells that came with military life. The sharp crack of rifle fire from the shooting range mixed with the salt air from the nearby ocean. Young sailors hurried past, some stealing glances at her silver hair, which she kept regulation short but had never bothered to dye. At her age, she had earned every gray strand through combat deployments, classified operations, and years of proving herself in a world that had not always been ready for women like her. The administration building loomed ahead, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Sarah had studied the personnel files of everyone she would be working with during her evaluation. Most were good officers, dedicated to training the next generation of America's elite warriors. But there were always a few who let their egos get in the way of their duties. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison was waiting for her in the lobby, checking his watch with obvious impatience. He was 35, fit, and carried himself with the swagger that often came with successful completion of advanced training programs. His file showed excellent performance records, but also several complaints about his treatment of female personnel that had been quietly handled through administrative channels. Morrison looked up as Sarah approached, his eyes immediately focusing on her hair rather than her insignia. His expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed disdain. In his mind, he was seeing an older woman who had probably spent her career behind a desk, now here to evaluate programs she could never understand. "Commander Martinez, I presume," Morrison said, extending his hand with a grip that lasted just a moment too long and pressed just a little too hard. "Welcome to Coronado. I have to say, I was expecting someone a bit more current with our operations." Sarah shook his hand firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. She had dealt with men like Morrison throughout her career. They saw her age, her gender, and made immediate assumptions about her capabilities. It was a mistake that had cost enemies their lives and colleagues their credibility. "Thank you for the warm welcome, Lieutenant Commander," Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. "I'm looking forward to observing your training protocols and seeing how we can continue to improve our selection processes." Morrison led her through the building, pointing out various offices and facilities with the air of someone giving a tour to a visiting politician rather than briefing a superior officer. He seemed particularly pleased to show off the physical training areas, where young candidates were pushing themselves through grueling exercises designed to separate those with the mental and physical toughness required for special operations from those who would wash out. "These men are pushing themselves to their absolute limits," Morrison explained as they watched a group struggling through an obstacle course. "SEAL training isn't just about physical strength, though. It's about mental toughness, the ability to function under extreme stress, and the kind of bond between warriors that can only be forged in the crucible of shared suffering." Sarah nodded, remembering her own time on similar courses. The cuts, bruises, and exhaustion that came with proving yourself worthy of wearing the trident. Morrison continued his commentary, seemingly unaware that he was lecturing someone who had not only completed the same training but had gone on to lead some of the most dangerous missions in recent military history. "Of course," Morrison added with a slight smirk, "not everyone is cut out for this kind of work. It takes a special type of person to handle the pressure, the physical demands, and the split-second life-or-death decisions that define special operations. They moved to the briefing rooms where candidates received instruction on tactics, weapons systems, and mission planning. Morrison made several comments about the importance of maintaining standards and not lowering the bar for anyone, regardless of political pressure from Washington. His meaning was clear, though he was careful not to state it directly. Sarah observed everything carefully, taking mental notes about the training procedures, the attitudes of the instructors, and the way Morrison interacted with his subordinates. She noticed how he commanded immediate respect from the younger officers, who clearly looked up to him as a successful graduate of the program they hoped to complete themselves. During a break in the tour, Sarah found herself in the facility's cafeteria, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and watching the dynamics between different groups of personnel. Morrison approached with two other officers, Lieutenant Rodriguez and Lieutenant Thompson, both recent SEAL graduates assigned to the training facility. "Mind if we join you, Commander?" Morrison asked, though he was already sitting down before she could answer. "I was just telling Rodriguez and Thompson here about some of the changes coming down from headquarters. Seems like there's a lot of pressure these days to modify our standards to accommodate different types of candidates." Rodriguez, a serious young man with intense dark eyes, looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Thompson, however, seemed eager to join in whatever point Morrison was making. "It's important to maintain the integrity of the program," Thompson said, glancing at Sarah as if expecting her to agree. "When you start making exceptions, you put lives at risk. The enemy doesn't care about diversity quotas." Sarah sipped her coffee and listened, recognizing the familiar arguments that had followed her throughout her career. She had heard them from instructors who tried to make her training harder, from fellow officers who questioned her assignments, and from politicians who used her achievements as talking points without understanding the sacrifices they represented. "What's your take on that, Commander?" Morrison asked, leaning back in his chair. "You must have seen a lot of changes during your time in the Navy. How do you balance maintaining standards with the political pressures to expand opportunities?" The question was loaded, designed to force her into either agreeing with their perspective or revealing herself as part of what they saw as the problem. Sarah set down her coffee cup and met Morrison's gaze directly. "In my experience, Lieutenant Commander, the most dangerous assumption you can make is thinking you know what someone is capable of based on how they look," she said quietly. "The enemy doesn't announce their capabilities in advance, and neither do the best warriors I've served with." Morrison's smile tightened slightly, but before he could respond, an announcement came over the facility's public address system calling for all personnel to report to the main assembly area for an unscheduled briefing. Sarah checked her watch and realized this was likely the moment she had been waiting for. As they walked toward the assembly area, Morrison continued to hold court with his junior officers, making comments about the importance of experience and proven track records in leadership positions. Sarah remained quiet, knowing that the next few hours would dramatically shift the dynamics of every conversation she had been having. The assembly hall was packed with personnel from across the facility. Sarah took a seat in the back while Morrison and his associates positioned themselves prominently in the front rows, where their experience and status would be clearly visible to everyone present. Captain Williams, the facility commander, took the podium and called for attention. He was a weathered veteran with the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect from everyone in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have an important announcement regarding some personnel changes that will be taking effect immediately," Williams began. "As you know, we are constantly working to improve our training protocols and ensure that we are developing the highest quality special operations personnel possible." Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission tension building in her chest. She had faced enemy fire, jumped out of aircraft in hostile territory, and led teams through situations where failure meant death. But there was something uniquely challenging about moments like this, when years of hidden service were about to be revealed. To assist with this ongoing improvement process, we have been assigned a new evaluation officer who will be conducting a comprehensive review of our procedures, Williams continued. This officer brings not only extensive administrative experience but also direct operational background in the very programs they will be evaluating. Morrison shifted in his seat, clearly expecting to be introduced as someone who would be working closely with whatever desk officer had been sent to observe their operations. I want to introduce you to someone whose background and qualifications are going to surprise some of you, Williams said, his voice taking on a different tone. This officer has completed multiple combat deployments, led classified operations that I cannot detail in this setting, and has just received a promotion that reflects both their exceptional service and the Navy's confidence in their leadership abilities. The room was completely silent now, with every person focused on Williams's words. Sarah remained seated, knowing that her moment was coming but wanting to let Williams set the stage properly. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our new evaluation officer and your commanding general, General Sarah Martinez. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah rose from her seat in the back of the room and began walking toward the podium, her boots clicking against the concrete floor in a steady rhythm that seemed to echo through the stunned assembly. Every head turned to follow her movement, and she could see the shock spreading across faces throughout the room. Morrison's jaw had dropped slightly, and his face was cycling through a range of expressions as he processed what he had just heard. The woman he had been condescending to for the past few hours, whose qualifications he had questioned and whose presence he had clearly resented, was now revealed to be not just his superior, but a general officer with authority over the entire facility. As Sarah reached the front of the room, she could see Rodriguez fighting back a smile while Thompson looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The younger personnel throughout the assembly were watching with fascination, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment that would become part of the facility's unofficial history. Williams stepped aside, allowing Sarah to take the podium. She looked out over the assembly, taking in the faces of the men and women who would be under her command for the duration of her evaluation. Some looked curious, others appeared nervous, and a few seemed to be calculating how their previous interactions with her might affect their careers. "Thank you, Captain Williams," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the assembly hall without any need for amplification. "I want to begin by saying that I understand this announcement may come as a surprise to some of you. That was intentional." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Over the past several hours, I have had the opportunity to observe this facility and interact with various personnel while my identity remained confidential. This approach has provided me with valuable insights into the culture, attitudes, and operational procedures that exist here when people believe they are not being evaluated by senior leadership." Morrison was staring straight ahead now, his face carefully composed but his neck slightly red. Sarah continued, her tone remaining professional but carrying an edge that made it clear she had noticed everything that had transpired. "During my time here, I have heard discussions about standards, qualifications, and the importance of proven track records. These are indeed crucial considerations in any military organization, particularly in special operations where the margin for error is essentially zero." She moved slightly away from the podium, adopting a more conversational stance that somehow made her presence even more commanding. "What I have not heard enough discussion about is the danger of assumptions. Assumptions about capability based on appearance. Assumptions about qualifications based on demographics. And assumptions about authority based on preconceived notions about who belongs in leadership positions." The room remained absolutely silent, but Sarah could sense the shift in attention as her words hit their mark. This was no longer just an announcement of a new commanding officer. This was a teaching moment that would reshape how everyone present thought about judgment, respect, and the true meaning of military professionalism. "I want to be clear about something," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the authority that came from years of leading men and women in life or death situations. "I am not here to prove anything to anyone. My record speaks for itself, though most of it will remain classified for reasons of national security. I am here to evaluate this facility's training protocols and ensure that we are developing the highest quality special operations personnel possible." She let that statement hang in the air before adding, "However, I am also here to ensure that the leaders responsible for that development understand the difference between maintaining standards and perpetuating prejudices that have no bearing on operational effectiveness." Morrison's hands were clenched in his lap now, and Sarah could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the assembly hall. She had not mentioned him by name, but everyone present understood exactly who her comments were directed toward. Over the coming weeks, I will be conducting comprehensive evaluations of training procedures, personnel management practices, and leadership effectiveness at all levels of this organization, Sarah announced. I will be observing classes, reviewing records, and conducting interviews with both instructors and candidates. She paused again, making eye contact with various personnel throughout the room. I encourage all of you to approach this process with the same professionalism and dedication to excellence that we expect from the candidates you are training. Remember that in special operations, success often depends on the ability to adapt quickly to new information and changing circumstances. The irony of that statement was not lost on anyone present, particularly Morrison, who was clearly struggling to process how dramatically his circumstances had changed in the span of a single announcement. Captain Williams will provide you with specific details about scheduling and procedures for the evaluation process, Sarah concluded. Until then, I expect all operations to continue at the same high standards this facility is known for maintaining. She stepped back from the podium, and Williams immediately called the assembly to attention. Every person in the room snapped to their feet in unison, creating a sound like a thunderclap that seemed to emphasize the gravity of what had just occurred. Dismissed, Williams announced, and the assembly began to disperse, though the conversations that immediately broke out were conducted in hushed tones that suggested everyone understood they had just witnessed something significant. Sarah remained at the front of the room, accepting congratulations from senior officers and answering questions about the evaluation timeline. She noticed that Morrison lingered near his seat, clearly wanting to approach but uncertain about how to begin a conversation that would necessarily involve acknowledging his earlier behavior. Eventually, the assembly hall cleared except for Sarah, Williams, and a few senior staff members who needed to discuss logistical details about her evaluation process. Morrison had left without making eye contact, though Sarah suspected she would be hearing from him soon. As the remaining officers discussed schedules and access requirements the following morning arrived with the crisp efficiency that defined military life at Naval Base Coronado. Sarah Martinez had spent most of the night reviewing personnel files, training protocols, and incident reports that painted a detailed picture of the facility's operations over the past 2 years. What she found confirmed many of her initial observations while revealing several concerning patterns that would require immediate attention. Her temporary office was located in the administration building's east wing, with windows overlooking the obstacle course where candidates pushed themselves through the grueling physical challenges that separated potential SEALs from those who would return to conventional Navy assignments. Sarah had arrived before dawn, partly from habit and partly because she knew that the early morning hours often revealed the most about an organization's true character. At precisely 0600 hours, there was a sharp knock on her office door. Sarah looked up from the report she was reviewing to see Lieutenant Commander Morrison standing at attention in the doorway, his uniform immaculate and his face carefully composed in an expression of professional neutrality. "General Martinez, sir," Morrison began, stumbling slightly over the proper form of address before recovering his composure. "I request permission to speak with you privately about yesterday's events and my conduct during your initial facility tour." Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk without looking up from the documents she was reviewing. She had expected this conversation, though she was mildly impressed that Morrison had chosen to address the situation directly rather than hoping it would simply be forgotten. "Please, sit down, Lieutenant Commander," she said, finally, meeting his gaze. "I assume you've had some time to reflect on our interactions yesterday." Morrison sat down stiffly, his back straight and his hands resting formally on his knees. The confident swagger that had characterized his behavior during the previous day's tour was completely absent, replaced by the careful demeanor of an officer who understood that his career trajectory might depend on the next few minutes. "I want to begin by acknowledging that my conduct yesterday fell well below the standards expected of a naval officer," Morrison said, his words carefully chosen and delivered with obvious rehearsal. "I made assumptions about your background and qualifications that were both unprofessional and inappropriate." Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying Morrison's face for signs of genuine understanding versus simple damage control. She had heard similar apologies throughout her career, and experience had taught her to distinguish between officers who truly recognized their mistakes and those who were simply trying to protect their positions. What specifically do you think you did wrong, Lieutenant Commander? She asked. I want to make sure we're both clear about the issues we need to address. Morrison shifted slightly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with having to articulate his failures in detail. I displayed a condescending attitude toward you based on assumptions about your gender and age. I made comments about maintaining standards that were inappropriate given that I had no knowledge of your actual background or qualifications. And I failed to show the respect due to a superior officer, regardless of whether I was aware of your rank at the time. Sarah nodded slowly, appreciating that Morrison had identified the core issues without trying to minimize them or make excuses. It was a start, though she knew that real change would require more than a single conversation. Tell me about your leadership philosophy, Lieutenant Commander, Sarah said, changing direction in a way that clearly caught Morrison off guard. How do you approach training and developing the candidates under your supervision? The question seemed to relax Morrison slightly, moving him into territory where he felt more confident. I believe in maintaining the highest possible standards while providing the support and mentorship necessary for candidates to reach their full potential, he said. SEAL training is designed to push people beyond what they think they're capable of, and my job is to create the conditions where that transformation can occur. And what role do you think unconscious bias plays in that process? Sarah asked, watching Morrison's expression carefully. Morrison paused, clearly considering his answer more thoughtfully than he might have before yesterday's revelation. I'm beginning to understand that my own biases may have affected my ability to accurately assess candidates and colleagues. If I'm making assumptions based on factors that don't relate to actual capability, then I'm not serving the mission or the people I'm supposed to be developing. Sarah pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk between them. These are incident reports, training evaluations, and personnel complaints from the past 18 months. Would you like to guess what pattern emerges when I analyze them by demographics? Morrison's face grew pale as he stared at the folder. Sarah continued without waiting for a response. Female candidates wash out of your training programs at a rate significantly higher than the facility average. Minority candidates receive more negative evaluations in subjective assessment categories. And there have been multiple informal complaints about your comments and attitudes toward personnel who don't fit your apparent definition of a typical SEAL candidate. She opened the folder and pulled out several specific documents. Here's an evaluation where you noted that a female candidate lacks the aggressive mindset necessary for special operations, despite the fact that she had just completed a training exercise with the second highest score in her class. Here's another way you recommended against advancement for a Hispanic candidate because he doesn't demonstrate the leadership presence expected at this level, even though his peer evaluations were overwhelmingly positive. Morrison stared at the documents, his jaw tightening as he recognized his own words and signatures. Sarah could see him processing the implications of having his pattern of behavior laid out so starkly. What I want to know, Lieutenant Commander, is whether you genuinely believe these assessments were based purely on observable performance, or whether you're now beginning to see how your assumptions might have influenced your professional judgment. The silence stretched between them for nearly 30 seconds before Morrison spoke, his voice quieter than it had been since entering the office. Looking at this pattern, I have to acknowledge that my assessments may have been influenced by factors that shouldn't have played any role in my evaluations. I thought I was being objective, but the data suggests otherwise. Sarah closed the folder and leaned forward slightly. Here's what's going to happen, Lieutenant Commander. You're going to undergo comprehensive bias awareness training, starting immediately. You're also going to work directly with me over the next 4 weeks to review every assessment you've made in the past year and develop new evaluation protocols that focus exclusively on performance metrics. Morrison nodded, though Sarah could see him struggling with the implications of what she was describing. Additionally, she continued, you're going to personally mentor 3 candidates who you had previously recommended for elimination from the program. I want you to apply the same energy and attention to their development that you would give to candidates you naturally favor. What if those candidates genuinely aren't capable of meeting the standards? Morrison asked. Then, they'll wash out based on objective performance measures rather than subjective assessments influenced by unconscious bias, Sarah replied firmly. But You might be surprised by what people can accomplish when they receive genuine support rather than skepticism. She stood up, signaling that the formal part of their conversation was ending. I want to be clear about something, Lieutenant Commander. This isn't punishment for its own sake. You're a talented officer with valuable experience, but you have blind spots that are affecting your ability to serve effectively. We're going to address those blind spots so you can become the leader this program needs. Morrison stood and snapped to attention. I appreciate the opportunity to correct my deficiencies and improve my performance. You have my commitment to approaching this process with complete honesty and dedication. After Morrison left, Sarah spent the next hour reviewing training schedules and preparing for her first direct observation of candidate instruction. She had decided to begin with physical training sessions, where performance could be measured most objectively and where leadership styles often revealed themselves most clearly. The obstacle course was already busy with the morning training rotation when Sarah arrived. She positioned herself where she could observe both the candidates struggling through the exercises and the instructors providing guidance and evaluation. What she saw was largely consistent with her expectations based on the previous day's observations. The male candidates received detailed technical coaching, with instructors breaking down specific techniques for improving their performance. Female candidates received more general encouragement but less specific instruction, as if the instructors assumed they either couldn't benefit from detailed technical advice or weren't worth the investment of time and effort. Sarah watched one particular sequence where a female candidate named Petty Officer Williams was struggling with a rope climbing exercise. Her technique was flawed, causing her to use excessive energy and failing to achieve the required time standard. Rather than stopping to provide specific instruction, the instructor simply yelled for her to try harder and find a way to make it work. 10 minutes later, a male candidate encountered the same problem with the same exercise. The same instructor immediately stopped the exercise, demonstrated the proper technique, explained the biomechanics involved, and provided specific drills for building the necessary strength and coordination. Sarah made detailed notes about the interaction, recognizing it as exactly the kind of subtle but significant difference that could determine whether candidates received the support they needed to succeed or were simply allowed to fail without proper instruction. During the lunch break, she approached Instructor Chief Petty Officer Reynolds, a 20-year veteran who supervised much of the physical training program. Reynolds was respected throughout the facility for his expertise and his ability to push candidates beyond their perceived limitations. Chief Reynolds, Sarah said, joining him as he reviewed training scores from the morning session. I've been observing the rope climbing instruction, and I wanted to get your perspective on coaching techniques for candidates who are struggling with that particular exercise. Reynolds looked up from his paperwork, clearly pleased to discuss training methodology with someone who appreciated the complexity of special operations preparation. Rope climbing is one of those exercises where technique matters more than raw strength, but most people try to muscle through it instead of learning the proper mechanics. The key is teaching them to use their legs and core effectively rather than relying on upper body strength alone. How do you decide when to provide detailed technical coaching versus allowing candidates to work through problems on their own? Sarah asked. It depends on the candidate and the specific issue, Reynolds replied. Some people learn better through trial and error, while others need step-by-step instruction. Part of my job is reading each individual and adapting my approach accordingly. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Have you noticed any patterns in terms of which candidates tend to benefit more from direct instruction versus independent problem solving? Reynolds paused, clearly considering the question more carefully than he initially expected. You know, I've never really analyzed it that way. I guess I tend to assume that the candidates with more natural ability can figure things out on their own, while the ones who are struggling need more hands-on help. And how do you determine who has more natural ability? Sarah asked, keeping her tone curious rather than challenging. Usually it's pretty obvious from their initial performance and their overall physical presence, Reynolds said, then stopped as he began to realize the implications of his own words. Sarah waited, allowing Reynolds to process his own answer before continuing the conversation. Chief, I'd like you to try an experiment over the next week, she said finally. I want you to provide the same level of detailed technical instruction to every candidate, regardless of your initial assessment of their natural ability. Then, we'll compare the improvement rates and see what we learn. Reynolds looked uncertain. That might slow down the overall training pace if I'm spending equal time with candidates who might not benefit from the additional instruction. Let's test that assumption, Sarah replied. I suspect you might find that some of the candidates you consider less naturally gifted will surprise you when they receive the same quality of instruction as everyone else. The afternoon brought Sarah's first opportunity to observe classroom instruction, where candidates received training on tactics, mission planning, and leadership principles. She positioned herself in the back of the room during a session on small unit tactics led by Lieutenant Rodriguez, the serious young officer who had seemed uncomfortable with Morrison's comments the previous day. Rodriguez's instruction was thorough and professional, and Sarah could see why he was considered one of the facility's rising stars. He presented complex tactical concepts in clear, understandable terms and encouraged questions from the candidates. What impressed Sarah most was that Rodriguez consistently called on all students equally, ensuring that quieter candidates had opportunities to participate in discussions. During a break in the instruction, Rodriguez approached Sarah with obvious nervousness about being observed by the new commanding general. I hope the instruction is meeting your expectations, Rodriguez said. I've been working to develop new teaching methods that help candidates better understand the practical application of tactical principles. Your instruction is excellent, Lieutenant Rodriguez, Sarah replied. I'm particularly impressed by how you ensure equal participation from all candidates. That's not always easy to achieve in a military classroom setting. Rodriguez looked pleased by the recognition. I've found that some of our best insights come from candidates who might not naturally speak up in group settings. If I don't make space for those perspectives, I'm missing opportunities to develop better tactical thinking across the entire group. Sarah made a note about Rodriguez's approach, recognizing it as the kind of inclusive leadership that could serve as a model for other instructors at the facility. The remainder of the afternoon was spent reviewing administrative procedures and meeting with support staff who handled candidate records, medical evaluations, and logistical coordination. These conversations revealed another layer of the cultural issues she was there to address. Several support staff members mentioned informal feedback they had received about certain candidates, often phrased as concerns about whether particular individuals would fit in with SEAL teams or had the right kind of background for special operations. When Sarah pressed for specifics, the concerns invariably related to factors that had nothing to do with job performance. By the end of the day, Sarah had a comprehensive picture of the facility's strengths and areas for improvement. The training programs themselves were generally excellent, with sophisticated curricula and experienced instructors who understood the demands of special operations. The problem lay not in the formal training protocols but in the informal attitudes and assumptions that influenced how those protocols were applied. As she prepared to leave her office that evening, Sarah reflected on the conversations and observations from her second day at the facility. Morrison's willingness to acknowledge his biases was encouraging, but real change would require systematic modifications to evaluation procedures, instructor training, and the cultural norms that shape daily interactions throughout the organization. Her phone buzzed with a message from Admiral Chen, her commanding off 3 weeks into her evaluation. General Sarah Martinez had established a routine that kept her connected to every aspect of the facility's operations. She arrived each morning before the candidates began their physical training, spent time observing different instructional programs throughout the day, and often remained late into the evening reviewing data and preparing detailed reports on her findings. The changes she had implemented were beginning to show measurable results, though not without resistance from some quarters. The new evaluation protocols required instructors to provide specific, documented justification for any assessment that deviated from objective performance measures. The bias awareness training had become mandatory for all instructional staff, and the mentorship program she had instituted was creating unexpected success stories among candidates who might otherwise have been eliminated from the program. Sarah was reviewing the latest training scores when her assistant knocked on the door and informed her that Petty Officer Williams was requesting to speak with her. Williams was the same candidate Sarah had observed struggling with rope climbing during her first week at the facility, and Her name had appeared frequently in Sarah's subsequent reports as an example of how improved instruction could dramatically impact candidate performance. "Send her in," Sarah said, curious about what had prompted Williams to request a personal meeting with the commanding general. Petty Officer Williams entered the office with the confident bearing that came from 3 weeks of intensive training and significantly improved performance scores. She was 26 years old, a former college athlete who had joined the Navy specifically to pursue special operations training. Her initial struggles with certain physical challenges had led some instructors to question whether she had the persistence necessary for SEAL operations, but her recent improvements had been remarkable. "General Martinez, thank you for agreeing to see me," Williams said, standing at attention until Sarah gestured for her to take a seat. "I wanted to speak with you about the changes that have been implemented in the training program and how they've affected my experience here." Sarah leaned forward, interested to hear a candidate's perspective on the modifications she had been observing from an administrative standpoint. "Please, speak freely, Petty Officer Williams. Your insights could be valuable for improving the program." Williams took a deep breath before beginning. "When I first arrived at this facility 6 weeks ago, I was confident in my abilities and committed to succeeding in the program. But after the first few weeks of training, I was beginning to doubt whether I belonged here. Not because the training was too difficult, but because I felt like I wasn't receiving the same level of instruction and support as other candidates." She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. "I don't want to sound like I was making excuses for poor performance, because I know that personal accountability is crucial in special operations. But I was struggling with certain exercises and techniques, and when I asked for help, I often received general encouragement rather than specific technical guidance." Sarah nodded, recognizing the pattern Williams was describing from her own observations. "Can you give me some specific examples?" "The rope climbing exercise is probably the best example," Williams continued. "I was using terrible technique and failing to meet the time standards, but the instruction I received was essentially just to try harder. It wasn't until Chief Reynolds started providing detailed technical coaching to all candidates that I learned the proper mechanics. Within a week, I had cut my time by nearly 40%. Williams pulled out a small notebook and referred to it as she continued. The same thing happened with several other challenges. Map reading and navigation, weapons maintenance, tactical movement techniques. Once I started receiving the same quality of instruction as everyone else, my performance improved dramatically." Sarah made notes as Williams spoke, appreciating the candidate's detailed observations and her ability to articulate the impact of the changes she had implemented. "How have the other candidates responded to the modified training approach?" "That's actually one of the most interesting things I've observed," Williams replied. "Initially, some candidates seemed to resent that instructors were spending equal time with everyone instead of focusing primarily on the top performers. But as the overall performance level of the class improved, the competitive environment became more challenging for everyone, which actually pushed the top performers to higher levels as well." Williams closed her notebook and looked directly at Sarah. "I want you to know that I'm not here to complain about my earlier experiences or to blame anyone for my initial struggles. But I am here to tell you that the changes you've implemented have transformed this program in ways that go beyond just helping individual candidates who might have been struggling." "How so?" Sarah asked. "The entire culture has shifted," Williams said. "Instead of an environment where some candidates received extensive support while others were essentially left to sink or swim, we now have a program where everyone is expected to help everyone else improve. The peer mentorship that has developed as a result has created stronger team cohesion and better overall performance across all candidates." Sarah smiled, recognizing that Williams had identified one of the most important outcomes of the changes she had implemented. Military effectiveness depended not just on individual capabilities but on the ability of personnel to function effectively as teams, and the training environment was beginning to reflect that reality. "I have one more observation that I think you should know about," Williams continued. "Yesterday, Lieutenant Commander Morrison approached me privately to apologize for his previous assessments and to acknowledge that his recommendations regarding my suitability for the program had been influenced by factors unrelated to my actual performance." Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised by this development. Morrison had been working with her closely on reviewing his evaluation procedures, but she hadn't expected him to take the initiative to directly address candidates he might have misjudged. "How did you respond to that conversation?" Sarah asked. "I thanked him for his honesty and told him that I appreciated his willingness to reconsider his assessments," Williams replied. "But I also told him that the most important thing was ensuring that future candidates receive fair evaluation from the beginning, rather than having to overcome initial prejudices." After Williams left, Sarah spent the rest of the morning reviewing performance data that confirmed many of the observations the young petty officer had shared. The overall performance levels across all demographic groups had improved significantly since the implementation of her new protocols, and the gap between different groups had narrowed considerably. More importantly, the facility was beginning to see improvements in team cohesion scores, peer evaluation ratings, and instructor assessments of leadership potential among the candidates. The changes she had implemented were affecting not just individual performance but the overall culture and effectiveness of the training program. That afternoon brought an unexpected challenge when Admiral Peterson, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, arrived for an unannounced inspection of the facility. Peterson was known throughout the special operations community as a demanding leader who had little patience for political correctness or administrative changes that might compromise operational readiness. Sarah received notification of Peterson's arrival just minutes before his helicopter touched down on the facility's landing pad. She quickly gathered her evaluation reports and prepared to brief the Admiral on her findings and the modifications she had implemented during her time at the facility. Peterson was exactly what Sarah had expected based on his reputation, a weathered veteran with intense eyes and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention from everyone around him. He was accompanied by 2 staff officers and a chief petty officer who served as his aide. "General Martinez," Peterson said as they met in the facility's main conference room. "I've been hearing interesting reports about the changes you've been implementing here. I wanted to see for myself what you've been up to." Sarah had prepared for this moment, knowing that Peterson would be skeptical of any modifications that he perceived as lowering standards or introducing political considerations into military training. She had organized her presentation to focus on measurable performance improvements rather than abstract concepts about bias or fairness. "Admiral Peterson, thank you for taking the time to visit," Sarah began. "I'd like to begin by showing you the performance data from the past 3 weeks compared to the previous 6 months. She distributed charts showing improvement trends across multiple performance categories, including physical fitness scores, technical skill assessments, leadership evaluations, and team cohesion measures. The data showed consistent improvements across all demographic groups, with the most dramatic gains among candidates who had previously been performing below program averages. Peterson studied the charts carefully, his expression revealing nothing about his reaction to the information. "These improvements are certainly impressive," he said finally. "What specific changes did you make to achieve these results?" Sarah walked through the modifications systematically, explaining how standardized instruction protocols ensured that all candidates received equal access to technical coaching, how revised evaluation criteria focused on objective performance measures, and how enhanced mentorship programs created more supportive learning environments. The key insight, Sarah explained, was that many candidates who appeared to be underperforming were actually receiving inadequate instruction rather than lacking the capability to meet program standards. When we provided equal access to quality training, performance levels improved dramatically across the board. One of Peterson's staff officers, Commander Hayes, raised a concern about whether the changes might be making the program easier or reducing its selectivity. Sarah had anticipated this question and was prepared with specific data. "Actually, Commander Hayes, the program has become more selective, not less," Sarah replied. "Our overall pass rate has remained consistent, but we're now graduating candidates with higher average performance scores. We're identifying and developing talent that was previously being overlooked while maintaining the same rigorous standards." She pulled out additional charts showing that the candidates graduating under the new protocols were performing better in advanced training phases and receiving higher ratings from their first operational assignments. The changes were producing better SEALs, not just more SEALs. Peterson leaned back in his chair, processing the information Sarah had presented. General Martinez, I have to admit that I came here expecting to find a program that had been compromised by political correctness and lowered standards. What I'm seeing instead is data suggesting that you've improved the effectiveness of this training facility while maintaining its rigor. He paused, then continued. I want to observe some of the training sessions myself before I make any final judgments, but your preliminary results are certainly encouraging. The remainder of Peterson's visit was spent observing various training activities, from physical challenges to classroom instruction to tactical exercises. Sarah accompanied him throughout the tour, pointing out specific examples of how the modified protocols were being implemented while maintaining the high standards that define SEAL training. During a break in the observations, Peterson pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. Off the record, General Martinez, I've been getting pressure from some quarters to investigate whether this facility was implementing changes that might compromise operational readiness. Your predecessor here was well regarded, and some people were concerned that bringing in new leadership might lead to modifications driven by political considerations rather than military necessity. Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext of Peterson's comment. Admiral, I can assure you that every change I've implemented has been driven by data and focused on improving operational effectiveness. I have no interest in compromising standards for any reason, political or otherwise. I can see that, Peterson replied. What I'm observing here is actually consistent with best practices from other high-performance organizations. The military has sometimes been slow to adopt training methodologies that the private sector has been using successfully for years. He looked out at the training area where candidates were working through a complex tactical exercise. The question now is whether these improvements can be sustained and scaled to other facilities. What you've accomplished here is impressive, but it needs to become standard practice throughout our special operations training programs. That evening, after Peterson and his team had departed, Sarah convened a meeting with the facility's senior staff to discuss the Admiral's observations and recommendations. The meeting included Captain Williams, Lieutenant Commander Morrison, Chief Reynolds, and several other key personnel who had been involved in implementing the new protocols. Admiral Peterson was clearly impressed with the performance improvements we've achieved, Sarah began. But he also made it clear that these changes need to be documented and systematized so they can be implemented at other facilities throughout the special operations community. Morrison, who had become one of the most vocal supporters of the new approaches after initially resisting them, raised his hand. I think it's important to acknowledge that these changes required a significant shift in mindset for many of us. Simply distributing new protocols to other facilities won't be enough if the instructors there don't understand why these approaches are more effective. Sarah nodded, appreciating Morrison's insight. His transformation over the past 3 weeks had been remarkable, and his perspective on the change process would be valuable for implementing improvements elsewhere. Lieutenant Commander Morrison makes an excellent point, Sarah said. We need to develop not just new procedures but comprehensive training programs for instructors that help them understand the reasoning behind these approaches and how to implement them effectively. Chief Reynolds added his own observations. One thing I've learned is that these methods require more initial preparation time but actually save time in the long run because candidates develop skills more quickly when they receive quality instruction from the beginning. The conversation continued for another hour, with the team developing detailed recommendations for scaling the improvements beyond their own facility. Sarah took careful notes, knowing that this implementation plan would become a crucial part of her final report to Naval Special Warfare Command. As the meeting concluded, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since her dramatic arrival 3 weeks earlier. The facility was performing better by every measurable standard, the culture had shifted toward more inclusive and effective leadership practices, and even the most initially resistant personnel had become advocates for the new approaches. But perhaps most importantly, the changes had demonstrated that improving diversity and inclusion didn't require compromising standards or operational effectiveness. When implemented properly, these improvements actually enhanced military capability by ensuring that talent was identified and developed regardless of the demographic characteristics of the personnel involved. 6 weeks into her evaluation, General Sarah Martinez faced a crisis that would test everything she had worked to build at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility. It began with an incident that occurred during a routine night navigation exercise, but quickly escalated into a situation that threatened to undermine all the progress she had achieved. The exercise involved candidates working in small teams to navigate through challenging terrain using only compass and map, simulating the kind of mission-critical skills they would need in operational environments. It was designed to test not only technical proficiency but also leadership, teamwork, and decision-making under pressure. Petty Officer Williams, who had become one of the program's success stories, was serving as team leader for a group that included 3 male candidates, Petty Officers Jackson, Chen, and Roberts. The team had been making excellent progress through the course when they encountered an unexpected obstacle that required quick thinking and adaptive leadership. According to the incident report that reached Sarah's desk the following morning, the team had successfully completed the navigation portion of the exercise and was returning to base when they discovered another team in distress. Petty Officer Martinez, leading the second team, had suffered what appeared to be a serious ankle injury and was unable to continue without assistance. The standard protocol for such situations was clear: teams were to immediately contact exercise controllers and request support rather than attempting to handle medical emergencies independently. However, Williams made the decision to have her team assist the injured candidate while sending Chen ahead to establish radio contact with the base. What should have been a straightforward rescue operation became complicated when Jackson began questioning Williams' authority and suggesting that he should take over leadership of the combined teams. The situation escalated when Jackson made comments about Williams' qualifications that other candidates later described as inappropriate and potentially discriminatory. Williams maintained command of the situation, coordinated the safe evacuation of the injured candidate, and successfully led both teams back to base. But Jackson had filed a formal complaint alleging that Williams had endangered personnel by deviating from established protocols and that her leadership during the crisis had been ineffective. Sarah reviewed the incident report while simultaneously examining the exercise controller's detailed observations, medical reports on the injured candidate, and written statements from all personnel involved. What emerged was a complex situation that revealed both the progress that had been made and the challenges that remained in changing institutional culture. The exercise controller's report painted a clear picture of Williams' performance. She had assessed the situation quickly, made sound tactical decisions, effectively coordinated resources, and demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptive leadership that special operations required. The injured candidate had received prompt and appropriate care, no one had been endangered, and the mission had been completed successfully. Jackson's complaint, however, told a different story. He alleged that Williams had been emotionally compromised by the emergency situation, had made decisions based on personal feelings rather than tactical considerations, and had refused to accept input from more experienced team members. His written statement was carefully worded to avoid explicit references to gender or bias, but the underlying implications were clear to anyone familiar with the subtle ways discrimination often manifested itself. Sarah spent the morning interviewing each candidate involved in the incident, starting with Chen, who had served as the communications link during the crisis. Chen's account was straightforward and consistent with the exercise controller's observations. Petty Officer Williams handled the situation exactly as I would expect from an effective team leader, Chen reported. She assessed the situation, made clear decisions, assigned specific tasks to each team member, and maintained communication with base throughout the operation. When Jackson started questioning her authority, she addressed it directly but professionally, keeping the focus on completing the mission safely. "Tell me about Jackson's behavior during the incident," Sarah requested. Chen hesitated briefly before responding. Jackson seemed to have a problem with taking orders from Williams from the beginning of the exercise. When the emergency occurred, he immediately suggested that he should take over leadership, even though Williams was the designated team leader and was handling the situation appropriately. Roberts, the third member of Williams' original team, provided a similar account with additional details about Jackson's specific comments. Jackson made statements about Williams not being tough enough to handle a real crisis and suggested that the injured candidate needed strong leadership to get through the situation. The implication was pretty clear that he didn't think Williams could provide that leadership. When Sarah interviewed Jackson, she found him confident in his position and seemingly unaware of how his behavior might be perceived by others. Jackson was 28, a former Marine with combat experience who had joined the Navy specifically to pursue SEAL training. His performance in the program had been solid but not exceptional, and his peer evaluations suggested that he sometimes had difficulty working effectively with team members he considered less capable than himself. General Martinez, I want to be clear that my concerns about the incident have nothing to do with Petty Officer Williams' gender, Jackson began. My objections are purely based on tactical considerations and leadership effectiveness during a crisis situation. Sarah listened carefully as Jackson explained his perspective, noting the careful language he used to frame his complaints in terms of operational concerns rather than personal characteristics. Petty Officer Jackson, Sarah said when he had finished his account, you mentioned that you have combat experience from your time in the Marines. Can you describe a situation where you had to work under the leadership of someone with less combat experience than yourself? Jackson considered the question. Yes. During my deployment in Afghanistan, I often worked under officers who had less field experience than I did. But they had the training, authority, and judgment necessary to make effective decisions. And how did you handle situations where you disagreed with their tactical decisions? Sarah asked. I would express my concerns through appropriate channels and, then, follow orders unless they were clearly illegal or would endanger personnel, Jackson replied. Sarah made notes about Jackson's responses, recognizing that he was articulating the correct principles while apparently failing to apply them consistently in practice. Petty Officer Jackson, based on the exercise controller's report and the statements from other team members, Petty Officer Williams' decisions were tactically sound and resulted in successful completion of the mission with no injuries or safety compromises. Given that information, do you still believe your objections to her leadership were justified? Jackson's confidence wavered slightly as he processed the question. I was concerned about the deviation from standard protocols and the potential risks involved in combining teams without direct authorization from exercise controllers. Those are reasonable concerns, Sarah acknowledged. But the appropriate way to address them would have been through post-exercise debriefing, not by challenging the team leader's authority during the operation itself. Wouldn't you agree? After completing her interviews, Sarah convened a meeting with Captain Williams and the facility's senior staff to discuss the incident and its implications for the training program. The situation had revealed both the progress that had been made and the ongoing challenges that remained in changing deeply ingrained attitudes and behaviors. This incident illustrates exactly why the changes we've implemented are necessary, Sarah began. We have a candidate who performed exactly as we would want a SEAL to perform in a real operational situation, but her leadership is being questioned based on factors that have nothing to do with her actual performance. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, who had become increasingly effective in his role since undergoing his own transformation, raised an important point. What concerns me is that Jackson's complaint is worded in a way that sounds reasonable on the surface but is actually undermining the kind of adaptive leadership we need in special operations. If we don't address this appropriately, it could discourage other candidates from taking initiative in crisis situations. Chief Reynolds added his perspective from the training standpoint. Williams' performance during that exercise was exactly what we're trying to develop in all our candidates. Quick thinking, clear decision-making, effective communication, and the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances. If we allow that kind of performance to be criticized based on irrelevant factors, we're sending the wrong message to everyone in the program. Sarah had already reached similar conclusions, but she appreciated hearing the staff's analysis of the situation. The incident was forcing them to confront the ongoing challenges of cultural change in an organization with deeply established traditions and expectations. Here's how we're going to handle this, Sarah announced. First, Petty Officer Williams will receive formal recognition for her performance during the exercise. Her leadership demonstrated exactly the qualities we want to see in our graduates, and that needs to be clearly acknowledged. She continued, second, Petty Officer Jackson will receive counseling about appropriate channels for raising concerns and the importance of supporting team leadership during operations. His concerns about protocol deviations were not unreasonable, but his method of addressing them was inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Third, Sarah added, we're going to use this incident as a case study in our leadership training curriculum. All candidates and instructors need to understand the difference between legitimate tactical concerns and challenges to authority based on irrelevant factors. The meeting was interrupted by Sarah's aide, who informed her that Admiral Peterson was calling with an urgent matter related to the facility's operations. Sarah took the call in her office, wondering if news of the incident had already reached higher levels of command. General Martinez, Peterson began, I've been getting some interesting feedback about your evaluation at Coronado. There are some people in Washington who are very interested in the improvements you've documented, and some others who are raising questions about the changes you've implemented. Sarah felt a familiar tension building, recognizing the political undercurrents that often surrounded efforts to improve diversity and inclusion in military organizations. Admiral, can you give me more specifics about the nature of these concerns? There's a group of retired officers who are claiming that special operations standards are being lowered to accommodate political pressure for increased diversity, Peterson explained. They are citing anonymous sources who claim that qualified candidates are being passed over in favor of less qualified individuals from preferred demographic groups. Sarah knew that these allegations were both predictable and dangerous. Even demonstrable improvements in performance and effectiveness could be undermined by claims that standards were being compromised, especially when those claims played into existing political narratives about military readiness. Admiral, every change I've implemented has been designed to improve performance and maintain the highest possible standards, Sarah replied. The data clearly shows that we're graduating better prepared candidates, not less qualified ones. I believe that, General Martinez, and the preliminary data you've provided supports your position, Peterson said. But perception can be as important as reality in these situations. I need you to prepare a comprehensive report that addresses these concerns directly and provides irrefutable evidence that your improvements have enhanced rather than compromised the program's effectiveness. After the call ended, Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon developing a strategy for addressing both the immediate incident with Jackson and Williams and the broader political challenges that were emerging around her evaluation. She recognized that the success of her mission would ultimately depend not just on improving the facility's operations but on building a case for change that could withstand political scrutiny and institutional resistance. That evening, she called Williams to her office for a private conversation about the incident and its broader implications. Petty Officer Williams, Sarah began, I want you to understand that your performance during yesterday's exercise was exemplary. You demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we expect from SEAL candidates, and you should be proud of how you handled a challenging situation. Williams sat up straighter, clearly relieved to hear the assessment. Thank you. I was concerned that the complaint might affect my standing in the program. The complaint has been thoroughly investigated, and it has no merit, Sarah assured her. However, I want to discuss with you the broader challenges you may face as you continue your career in special operations. Sarah leaned forward, adopting a more personal tone. Williams, you're going to encounter people throughout your career who will question your qualifications, challenge your authority, and attribute your achievements to factors other than your actual performance. The key to success is continuing to perform at the highest level while building alliances with colleagues who recognize and value your contributions. How do you handle situations where people make assumptions about your capabilities? Williams asked. Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey through similar challenges. You let your performance speak for itself, you maintain professional standards even when others don't, and you never allow other people's limitations to become your own. Most importantly, you remember that every challenge you overcome makes it easier for the people who come after you. As Williams left her office, Sarah reflected on how much the young petty officer reminded her of herself at that age. The same determination, the same willingness to prove herself through performance rather than politics, and the same quiet confidence that came from knowing she belonged exactly where she was. 8 weeks after her dramatic arrival at Naval Base Coronado, General Sarah Martinez stood before the assembled personnel for her final address as commanding officer of the evaluation team. The transformation she had overseen was now documented in a comprehensive report that would reshape special operations training throughout the Navy, but the true measure of success would be whether the changes survived her departure. The assembly hall was packed with candidates, instructors, and staff who had witnessed and participated in the most significant cultural shift in the facility's recent history. Among them was Petty Officer Williams, who would graduate the following week as honor candidate of her class, and Lieutenant Commander Morrison, who had become one of the most effective advocates for the new training protocols. Sarah took the podium with the same quiet confidence she had displayed throughout her career, but now she carried the additional authority that came from having proven that excellence and inclusion were not competing values but complementary strengths that enhanced military effectiveness. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the assembled crowd, 8 weeks ago, I arrived at this facility to conduct what many of you assumed would be a routine evaluation of training procedures. What we have accomplished together during that time has exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. She gestured to the large screens behind her, which displayed charts showing the dramatic improvements in candidate performance, instructor effectiveness, and overall program outcomes. These numbers tell a story of transformation that goes far beyond simple policy changes. They demonstrate what becomes possible when we align our practices with our principles and ensure that every person has the opportunity to contribute their full potential to our mission. The data was indeed compelling. Graduation rates had remained consistent, but the average performance scores of graduating candidates had increased by 15%. More importantly, follow-up assessments from operational units indicated that recent graduates were performing significantly better in their first assignments compared to previous classes. The improvements you see here were not achieved by lowering standards or compromising the rigorous selection process that defines SEAL training, Sarah continued. They were achieved by ensuring that our standards are applied consistently and fairly, and that every candidate receives the instruction and support necessary to reach their full potential. She paused, making eye contact with various personnel throughout the assembly. Some of you may be wondering whether these changes will survive my departure, or whether this facility will gradually return to its previous practices once the evaluation is complete. I want to address that concern directly. Sarah had spent considerable time over the past 2 weeks working with Captain Williams and the senior staff to institutionalize the improvements in ways that would be difficult to reverse. The new protocols had been incorporated into official training manuals, instructor certification requirements had been updated to include bias awareness training, and evaluation procedures had been systematized to ensure consistent application across all programs. The changes we have implemented are now part of this facility's official operating procedures, she announced. More importantly, they are being adopted as standard practice throughout Naval Special Warfare Command, based on the demonstrated improvements in effectiveness and readiness. This announcement generated a noticeable reaction throughout the assembly. Sarah had learned just that morning that Admiral Peterson had approved her recommendations for system-wide implementation, recognizing that the improvements could not be ignored regardless of any political considerations that might have initially generated resistance. However, Sarah continued, policies and procedures are only as effective as the people who implement them. The real measure of our success will be whether each of you carries forward the lessons learned during this evaluation and applies them consistently in your daily duties. She looked directly at Morrison, who had become living proof that even deeply ingrained attitudes could change when confronted with clear evidence and proper motivation. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, would you please stand? Morrison rose from his seat, clearly surprised to be singled out during the general's final address. Sarah continued, 8 weeks ago, Lieutenant Commander Morrison and I had a very difficult conversation about assumptions, biases, and the impact they can have on our ability to develop effective military personnel. Today, he stands as an example of the kind of leadership transformation that makes lasting change possible. Morrison's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his professional composure as Sarah continued. Lieutenant Commander Morrison has not only modified his own practices but has become one of this facility's most effective advocates for ensuring that every candidate receives equal access to quality training and fair evaluation. His example demonstrates that change is possible at any level of experience when leaders are willing to examine their own practices honestly. She gestured for Morrison to be seated, then continued with her remarks. The lessons we have learned here extend far beyond this facility or even the special operations community. They apply to every organization that depends on identifying and developing human potential under challenging conditions. Sarah moved away from the podium, adopting a more conversational tone that drew the assembly's attention even more closely. Military effectiveness has always depended on our ability to find and develop the best possible personnel regardless of where that talent might be found. Throughout history, our greatest advantages have come from recognizing capability that others overlooked or underestimated. She paused, allowing that observation to resonate before continuing. What we have proven here is that when we eliminate barriers that have nothing to do with actual performance, we don't compromise excellence, we enhance it. When we provide equal access to quality training and mentorship, we don't lower standards, we help more people reach higher standards. The assembly remained completely focused on her words, and Sarah could sense that her message was connecting with personnel at all levels of the organization. The candidates who will graduate from this program in the coming weeks represent the future of special operations. They have been selected and trained using procedures that focus exclusively on the qualities that matter in operational environments: intelligence, determination, physical capability, teamwork, and leadership under pressure. She looked specifically at Williams and several other candidates who had benefited from the improved training protocols. These graduates will carry with them not only the technical skills necessary for special operations but also an understanding of what true military professionalism looks like. They will know that capability and character are the only qualifications that matter, and they will apply that knowledge throughout their careers. Sarah returned to the podium for her concluding remarks, knowing that these would be among the most important words she spoke during her time at the facility. To the candidates who are preparing to graduate, you have earned your place through performance, not privilege. You have demonstrated that you possess the skills, determination, and character necessary for special operations. As you move forward in your careers, remember that your success creates opportunities for others and that your professionalism sets the standard for those who will follow. She shifted her attention to the instructional staff. To the instructors and staff who make this program possible, you now have tools and procedures that will help you identify and develop talent more effectively than ever before. Use them consistently, apply them fairly, and continue to refine them based on evidence rather than assumption. Finally, she addressed the senior leadership present in the assembly. To the officers who will carry these improvements forward, remember that institutional change requires constant attention and commitment. The progress we have made here will only be sustained if it is actively supported and reinforced at every level of leadership. Sarah took a moment to look out over the assembly one final time, taking in the faces of people who had been part of a transformation that would influence military training for years to come. The past 8 weeks have demonstrated something that I have known throughout my career. The United States military is at its best when it focuses on what people can do rather than what they look like or where they come from. She straightened to her full height, embodying the authority and dignity that had carried her through decades of military service. The mission you perform here is critical to our national security. You are developing the warriors who will protect American interests in the most challenging environments and dangerous situations our nation faces. That mission deserves your absolute best efforts, your unwavering professionalism, and your commitment to excellence without exception. The standards you maintain must be the highest possible, but they must also be applied with the fairness and consistency that reflect our military values. When you combine rigorous standards with equal opportunity, you get exactly what we have achieved here: better performance, stronger teams, and more effective military units. Sarah moved to her conclusion, knowing that these final words would be remembered long after the specific details of policies and procedures had been forgotten. 8 weeks ago, some of you saw a woman with silver hair and made assumptions about what she was capable of. Today, I hope you understand that capability cannot be judged by appearance, that experience comes in many forms, and that excellence requires us to look beyond surface characteristics to find the qualities that truly matter. She paused, allowing the parallel between her own experience and the broader lessons of the evaluation to resonate throughout the assembly. As I prepare to leave this facility, I am confident that the changes we have implemented will continue to improve military readiness and effectiveness. But, more importantly, I am confident that the people in this room understand why those changes were necessary and will continue to refine and improve them in the years ahead. The transformation that began 8 weeks ago is not ending with my departure. It is just beginning. Each of you now carries the responsibility for ensuring that this facility, and the military as a whole, continues to evolve in ways that enhance our capability to defend our nation. Sarah stepped back from the podium and called the assembly to attention. Every person in the room rose simultaneously, creating the crisp sound that marked important moments in military life. "Dismissed," she announced, and the assembly began to disperse, though the conversations that immediately followed were conducted in the subdued tones that indicated everyone understood they had witnessed something significant. As the assembly hall gradually emptied, Sarah remained at the podium, accepting congratulations from senior officers and answering final questions about implementation timelines and follow-up procedures. She noticed that Williams approached with several other candidates, clearly wanting to express their appreciation for the changes that had transformed their experience in the program. "General Martinez," Williams said, speaking for the group, "we wanted to thank you for everything you've accomplished here. The improvements you've made will benefit not just our class but every candidate who comes after us." Sarah smiled, remembering her own mentors who had created opportunities that she had been able to build upon throughout her career. "Petty Officer Williams, the best way to thank me is to carry these lessons forward in your own leadership. Make sure that the people you lead receive the same opportunities for development that you have received here." As the last of the personnel departed and Sarah gathered her materials, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 8 weeks earlier, she had walked into this facility as an undercover evaluator whose qualifications were questioned and authority dismissed. She was leaving as a respected leader whose improvements had been validated by measurable results and would be implemented throughout the special operations community. The transformation had been complete, but, more importantly, it had been proven sustainable. The changes were now embedded in official procedures, supported by documented evidence, and championed by the very people who had initially resisted them. The work of cultural change was never finished, but a foundation had been established that would continue to strengthen over time. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Admiral Peterson. "Outstanding work at Coronado. Ready to discuss your next assignment. We have several facilities that could benefit from similar evaluations." She smiled as she read the message, recognizing that her successful transformation of the Coronado facility had created new opportunities to extend similar improvements throughout the military. The work was far from over, but she had proven that change was possible even in the most tradition-bound organizations when it was approached with the right combination of authority, evidence, and persistence. As Sarah walked across the base for the final time, she could see candidates engaged in the same rigorous training that had defined the facility for decades. But now that training was being delivered with new attention to fairness, consistency, and the full development of human potential. The future SEALs being developed under these improved protocols would be better prepared, more capable, and more representative of the diverse strengths that made America's military the most effective fighting force in the world. The transformation was complete, and it was working exactly as Sarah had known it would. Excellence and inclusion were not competing values but complementary strengths, and the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility at Coronado now stood as proof of what became possible when that truth was finally recognized and implemented. The real victory was not that assumptions had been challenged or biases confronted, but that better warriors were being developed through better training practices. That was a victory that would benefit national security for generations to come, and it was exactly the kind of success that had defined Sarah Martinez's remarkable career from the very beginning. Her work at Coronado was finished, but the transformation she had initiated would continue long after her departure, carried forward by the people who had learned that true military excellence demanded nothing less than the full utilization of America's greatest strategic asset, the unlimited potential of its people. The incident had revealed that despite all the progress that had been made, the work of cultural transformation was far from complete. But it had also demonstrated that the changes were producing exactly the kind of leaders the military needed, and that those leaders were prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The final test would be whether the improvements could survive the political pressures and institutional resistance that were beginning to emerge. But, as Sarah prepared her comprehensive report for Admiral Peterson, she was confident that the data would speak for itself and that the progress they had achieved would prove impossible to ignore or dismiss. The transformation had reached a critical point, but Sarah had faced far greater challenges during her career and had never backed down from a fight worth winning. This was definitely a fight worth winning. The real test would be whether these improvements could be sustained after her departure and successfully implemented at other facilities. But, as Sarah prepared her preliminary report for Admiral Peterson, she was confident that the foundation had been established for lasting change that would benefit the special operations community for years to come. The transformation that had begun with a single dramatic revelation was now becoming a systematic improvement in how the military developed its most elite warriors. And the best part was that it was working exactly as Sarah had known it would, based on decades of experience proving that capability and character were the only qualifications that truly mattered in military service. ISA at Naval Special Warfare Command. The message was brief but supportive. Heard about your dramatic entrance yesterday. Looking forward to your preliminary assessment report. Take whatever time you need to do this right. Sarah smiled as she gathered her materials and prepared to head to her temporary quarters. The real work was just beginning, but she had already seen signs that change was possible. The question now was whether she could implement lasting improvements that would survive her departure and continue to benefit future generations of candidates. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to reshape how the facility approached its mission. But, as Sarah walked across the base in the gathering twilight, she felt the familiar satisfaction that came from tackling a complex problem with the skills and experience she had spent decades developing. The transformation was underway, and there was no turning back. Immense, Sarah reflected on the events of the afternoon. She had encountered countless versions of Morrison throughout her career, men who made assumptions about her capabilities based on factors that had nothing to do with her training, experience, or track record. What made this situation different was not just her authority to address those assumptions directly, but the opportunity to use this moment as a teaching experience for the entire facility. The young officers and candidates who had witnessed Morrison's behavior and her response would carry that lesson forward in their own careers. The real work was just beginning. Sarah's evaluation would need to be thorough, professional, and focused on genuinely improving the facility's operations rather than settling personal scores. But she had also sent a clear message about expectations for professional conduct and the consequences of allowing prejudices to influence military operations. As the meeting concluded and the other officers departed, Sarah found herself alone in the assembly hall where her military career had just taken another unexpected turn. In a few hours, word of what had happened would spread throughout the base and beyond. By tomorrow, every officer and candidate in the facility would understand that their new commanding general was not what anyone had expected. The real question now was whether the lesson would stick, and whether the changes she implemented would outlast her temporary assignment. But, as Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to begin the most challenging evaluation of her career, she felt the familiar confidence that came from knowing she had earned her position through service, sacrifice, and a level of competence that spoke for itself. The transformation had begun, and there would be no going back.